All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martha Cole. I'm a historian here at the Montana Historical Society, and it's my great privilege to introduce John Fraley. He received his Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology at University of Montana and a master's degree in Fish and Wildlife Management from Montana State University. He worked for nearly 40 years for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, mostly in the Forks on the Flathead. He has also taught wildlife conservation and other courses at Flathead Valley Community College. Among his books are A Woman's Way West and Wild River Pioneers, both about early settlers in the Flathead. His most recent book is Rangers, Trappers, and Trailblazers, Early Adventures in Montana's Bob Marshall Wilderness and Glacier National Park, which is what he'll be talking on today. So please help me welcome John Fraley.
Thanks. Well, boy, thanks a lot for coming, guys. Do you want to dim the lights a little bit so we can see the slides better? Probably, maybe. So, I'm overwhelmed. I didn't see all of you. Some of you came in when I wasn't watching. I was a little worried for a while. It's a beautiful day. And again, my name is John Fraley. I'd like to point out a few people here. We have Will and Linda from Far Country Press back there, if you guys would raise your hand. Far Country's been terrific to work with. And in the back there also, you see Glenn Marks, if you could raise your hand there, and his wife Terry. Glenn is actually my young mentor. I have a couple old mentors, and Glenn is my young mentor. So I'm sure glad he came today. And we've had a lot of discussions that have helped me out as I've written these books. So you can't write a book like this without a lot of people being involved. And this is a list here of just some of the folks that helped me write the book and some of the people that gave me pictures and background and letters and things like that. And special thanks to Helen Dolan. Helen was Jack Dolan. It was actually one of the few rangers with disabilities that I know of in the Bob. And she kept his entire collection of pictures of Henry Thol, a lot of the pictures you're going to see today, and didn't let them go by the wayside somewhere. It's just amazing how things get lost so easily unless someone does that. 125 sources. A lot of the things, you'd be surprised at how important death certificates and internment cards are, too, to get information on folks. It's really good. So the location map, what we're going to be talking about today is mostly the Big Prairie area and coming out to Ovando and starting out in mainly the South Fork and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. And what I've tried to do with these books is, I think every life deserves to be remembered. And so many lives aren't remembered. I asked even in a foresters group, how many people have heard of Henry Thol, who I'm going to talk about? One hand out of like 20 people. How many people have heard of Yammer Workala? Nobody, which I gave a presentation on that the other day. And so I just think people, and I don't know what you think of this, because my sister the other day said that people are going to think you're crazy if you keep this up. And I said, they already do anyway, it doesn't matter. But I think that people kind of long to be remembered after they're gone. Think about it. Do you want to just be forgotten? Do you want to be celebrated and remembered? And I think even if it's just for the person doing the remembering, I think it's very important. So I want to take you into Big Prairie. How many of you have been to Big Prairie? Okay, a couple of you. All right, a few of you. It is so remote and it is so beautiful. I spent 10 days last year at Big Prairie as a station guard. I was a volunteer station guard. And every night I would carry my chair off the porch and sit out in this meadow and watch the dusk come down upon me. It's such an incredibly quiet place. It's just amazing. And it's always been the flagship ranger station back there. These are the folks that are there now. This is Bill Workman. This is Guy Zollner. This is what the station looks like. It's always been kind of the flagship. But I'm going to take you back, way back to the beginning of it. If you climb up on a little ridge, Pack Rat Mountain, then you can see it from, this is telephoto from above, and these are the buildings you're going to see. These are the buildings you would see from the flat, but you can't get as good a perspective. This is the actual ranger station, the ranger's residence, the tool shed, and then the old ranger station's over here. So what is it about Big Prairie that's so awesome? Well, the river, the South Fork of the Flathead, flows right by Big Prairie. And I remember last year taking some of the trail crew kids down here and teaching them how to fly fish a little better and catching some beautiful cutthroat right there. The West Slope cutthroat up there are genetically pure, and they're also the largest, oldest cutthroat in the world that live in streams. So it's very interesting. It's very special. And then we have bull trout as well. How many of you have ever caught a bull trout or a West Slope cutthroat? Okay, so it's an awesome native fish. So during the time that Big Prairie was its own ranger district, it was its wholly ranger district, there were several dozen rangers that served there. And we're going to focus in on, today, Henry Thol, right here. He was there from 25 to 30, and then he was here again in 1943. And he actually met Bob Marshall in the Bob, and I'll be telling you about that. Now, does Thol sound familiar? Does that name sound familiar to anyone? How many of you have read, oh, go ahead. Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot. But how many of you have read Young Men in Fire? Okay, Henry Thol was the Forest Service ranger who had horrible grief. His son, Henry Thol Jr., died as the last person up. He was the highest one on the hill to die. And Henry tried to get a lawsuit to the Forest Service. He testified 28 pages of testimony of why fire from Wag Dodge killed his boy and the other boys. So anyway, that's Henry Thol Sr. and his son, Henry Thol Jr. He was grooming him for a career in the Forest Service. So Henry, when we're going to be talking about Henry here, this is, of course, before he lost his son, but his son was born while he was doing this rangering we're going to be talking about. So Big Prairie in 1908 to 1916 looked like this. It was an old trapper's cabin that they modified to have for the ranger station. Then in 1916, this ranger station was built, and it served all the way to the 30s. The last ranger to serve during this period where it was its own ranger district was Jack Dolan. And again, amazing guy. His arm was missing below the elbow on his right arm, but he was very highly celebrated as a ranger. And I don't know, does anyone in here know Bud Moore? Bud Moore, the conservationist? Okay. Well, Bud actually gave Jack his first job, and he wrote later that it was the greatest thing he ever did to hire Jack Dolan. And this is the husband of the lady that saved all that information in those pictures that you're going to be seeing. So this is, again, the Flagship Ranger Station in the 60s. That's Jack right there. And so now I'm going to take you back. Henry Thol served as Big Prairie Ranger, as I said, during that period of time. And in the book, I call him the Ranger's Ranger. He was an amazing guy, and you're going to see some of the examples of why. First of all, he killed this big grizzly bear, and it made the papers all over the state. I used MontanaNewspapers.org. What a resource. And I found it where everybody said, kills giant grizzlies. They went all the way from 1,000 pounds to 2, it's all exaggerated. And the thing about Henry, though, and he killed, mountain lions. The thing about Henry was, I want to defend Henry a little bit, because in the book you'll see that he kills predators as he moves through and does his patrols, like all the way from Coram to Ovando. It's almost like his main point was to kill predators. And back then, the Forest Service and the Park Service endorsed that. They actually wanted the rangers to trap coyotes and other predators. And that was because they felt that there were good animals, like beaver and elk and deer. And then there were bad animals like mountain lion, coyote, especially the coyote, and the wolf. And even Theodore Roosevelt believed this too. If you know the story of the Kaibab Plateau, he thought, get rid of the predators, we'll have more of a paradise of wildlife. So Henry Thol, you think he's a pretty sharp guy and everything, but he made one insane patrol. And if you read the book, it's just hard to believe what he did and that he didn't prepare better and that kind of thing. But this kind of takes you to where, shows you a little bit about Henry. So the game warden in Ovando, you've all probably been to Ovando, Trixie's and all that. The Forest Service station used to be in that area for the Flathead. He called the Forest Service up in the Flathead and said, hey, there's beaver poachers in the upper Danaher, and they're poaching beaver. And so Henry was so zealous about, beaver was a good animal. They're trying to build them up, that population up. He said, okay, we're gonna go from the Swan side and come in from the north. They'll never suspect us. We'll find them, So what he did was he crossed the Swan Range by Condon and the upper end of Buck Creek. Now, Dave Owen, the Forest Service Ranger that's still around, says, no, he didn't. There's no way he could do it. He couldn't have done it. But both the reports I found of Henry talking about it, he claims he did. So I'm going with Henry, and I'm saying he did. And the only problem was he figured, okay, we're going to hop over the top of the Swan there. We're going to go down Big Salmon Creek, Big Salmon Lake, and then hit them from the north. And they're down more to the south towards Abando and DELANARE and that kind of area. So he said, all we need is food for 2 days because we're going to get to White River, and there's all kinds of food in Joe Murphy's cabin there. Okay? I can't believe Henry would make a mistake like that because the guy he had with him was Jim Deal. And Jim was this college kid. The reason I know is because Bob Marshall met Jim in there, and in his diary, he said Jim Deal was a college kid, graduated from Penn State in forestry. That's the only way I know that, because Bob said that. Bob was amazing. You'll see the stuff he said there. So the first day, they got to the head of Buck Creek, and forgive me for these Google Earth images, but it's not the right time of the year. Think about this as winter. There's really heavy snow. But at any rate, the first day, they got to the head of Buck Creek, and then what they did is they dropped down. They dropped down from the crest and went past Terrace Lakes, which I've looked at in the summer. I thought, oh my gosh, how did they do that? And then took this big shortcut and came out at Big Salmon Creek instead of going way out around Upper Holland Lake and that kind of thing. So the second night they were there. And what happened was they got dumped on with huge, soft piles of snow, and they really slowed down. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this, but you can see this is, if you imagine, this is kind of probably what it looked like. First, it plunged into 40-degree below temperatures. And if you've ever tried to snowshoe or ski with that heavy snow up to your knees, it takes forever. You go real slow. And that's what happened to them. They slowed down. Remember, they only had food for 2 days. So, and Jim, the college kid, appeared to be really awkward on snowshoes. And Henry could only go as fast as Jim would go. I had kind of an experience like this too, but I'm amazed that Henry would make that mistake. And so this is the kind of snow they were dealing with. This isn't them. This is like an example. It's actually my daughter. but it's that kind of snow. And she has skis on. Once you get into that, it so slows you way down. And at night, the only way they could survive was to chop enough wood. If you've ever had a fire in heavy snow, it just kind of keeps melting its way down. You're kind of in a pit. And the only way they survived this 40 below was to continually chop wood and have this big fire all night long. They didn't sleep until they got to Murphy's cabin. And Henry wouldn't let Jim use the axe because he figured if Jim broke the axe handle, we're dead. We're dead. We couldn't survive because they're moving so slow and it was so cold. So they're only moving like 8 miles a day, and this is the Forest Service finest. Henry could easily go way farther than that if he had decent conditions, and if he didn't have, I'm thinking Jim really slowed him down. And this is right directly from his journals, from Henry's report. And then I just pushed it onto the landscape to try to give you an example of it. So they camped again along Big Salmon Lake on the 4th night. So now they're already out 4 days. They thought they were going to be to Murphy's cabin in 2 days. So at this point, they were going to try to catch a squirrel or a bird and maybe eat that, or maybe try to catch a fish with it using it as bait, but they weren't able to do it. That was probably way more snow than this. I took this picture in the early 90s, late in the winter when there wasn't much snow, soft snow. So anyway, the whole point is, in the backcountry, you need humility and you need caution, and that will equal survival. This patrol, even though Thol was maybe the best ranger ever in the Forest Service, he didn't involve any of these things. He didn't have humility, didn't use caution, and he wasn't careful, and he didn't choose his person correctly. So it's kind of inexplainable. One thing I did forget to say, I think it came up on the screen, but yeah, they had to jump over the top of a crest of a cornice, and Henry always said it was the most dangerous thing he ever did. They had jumped like 12 feet and hit the snow and slide down it. So they had been through a lot. So they survived another night, and they dropped into the South Fork floodplain. So now they're into the main South Fork floodplain. Took them 5 days to get there. And they hit this blizzard. And at that point, Jim just says, I'm giving up. I'm just laying down. I'm going to just die right here. Well, Henry wouldn't let him do that. And so he dragged him to his feet, and they kept heading to the Joe Murphy cabin. And so they made it to Murphy Flats. It's about 10 miles, and they actually made it to the Joe Murphy cabin, which it's a good thing that was there, or they wouldn't have made it. They still had 8 or 10 miles to Big Prairie. Couldn't have made it. And so remember, it's 40, 50 below zero the whole time they were back, and it's documented. And so they reached this cabin, and they'd survived this reckless approach, but there they rested a couple of days, ate a whole bunch of food. The cabins, you keep food in there. And Who do you think took this picture? Any guesses? What's that? Joe wasn't around well, he was around, but he wasn't in the winter. But anyway, that's a great guess, but actually Henry took it. Henry was sent back to the Forest Service, sent him back east, and he took a 4-month course on photography. And so in the middle of a trip that they almost died on, he's taking self-timed pictures. I mean, and back then that was, advanced. We're talking about 1927 here. So I know, I just can't believe it. The stuff he hauled into there. Because they thought they'd had all the food they need. So then they went from Joe Murphy's special use permit cabin, it's like a lodge, only one in the Bob, and they went to Big Prairie. That was about 8 miles. So they walked up on the porch at Big Prairie, and this is that little station that was built in 16. And they looked at the mercury, and it was 47 degrees below zero, but it was in a blob, so it was actually a lot colder than that. So it had to be like 50 degrees below zero at least, or 60. So when they get to Big Prairie, what do they get when they get to Big Prairie? Maybe you've been in there, or any big Forest Service station. Lots of food. When I worked at Big Prairie this summer, I couldn't believe the food. I mean, some of it's 5, 6, 8 years past date. But they have so much food in there. I mean, if you've been to Big Prairie, the attached sort of a warehouse they have to Big Prairie, it's just unbelievable. You look at it and go, oh my gosh, because I was in charge of bringing all the food from the root cellars over to and helping all the crews pack it up and stuff like that. You can't believe how much food. So they were what? They were in hog heaven at this point. And they got away with it. So this really, they're only halfway at this point. So, and remember, they're like 8 days in or so. So they recover there, prepare for this mush on to Danaher, because now they're almost going to be where they can catch the poachers. They're just really excited, So they go 12 miles to Basin, and then that's day 11. Then the next day, and remember, it's all snow. Next day they go to Danaher. And so they're on mile 12 at this point. Now, the area they're going in, I don't have winter pictures of it, but this is the upper Danaher. Henry took this picture, and this is another picture of it. And you can see, doesn't that look like real beavery country? And the foresters estimate, I think it was 800 and some beaver in the Danaher. So Henry was proud of that, because part of his big duties in there at Big Prairie is keeping fur poachers out, and he had been very successful. And so they mushed into the Danaher, and they had reached now 70 miles, but they found no trace of beaver trappers. Now, what do you think they thought of Harry Morgan, the game warden, at this point, who told them they were in there? I bet they wanted to get out just so they could have a word with him. And in fact, what Henry said was, the beavers were unmolested. And the fun thing about Henry was he's from Germany, and he had these really cute words he used, like he used menace a lot. The coyotes are a menace. The poachers are a menace. The mountain lion's a menace. And then he also used molested. He'd say, well, we hiked up to check out Clayton Cabin as ordered, and it was unmolested. He used that a lot. So he quote him, he said the beavers were unmolested. So day 13, they left the drainage over the Dry Fork Danaher Divide and down the North Fork of the Blackfoot. They started doing an elk survey while they were at it on the way down. And they came out, basically, the first ranch house from Ovando they got to, they knocked on the door and they were okay. And they'd gone, over 100 miles. And what a patrol. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, but they didn't have any apparent communication. So none of the 9-wire phones were working, apparently, because of all the heavy snow. So nobody knew where they were. And that was about 14 days. So Harry was organizing a search party. That was nice of him after sending them in there. And when they got out. And in my opinion, given that temperature and that terrain, it's got to be, I'm going to say, the most risky and daring patrol in the history of the Bob. And in the annals, it will never be equaled. And I think those two, they broke all the rules they lived to tell about. And I think those two somewhere, their spirits kind of hovering over there. And it was like I said, it was an amazing, I don't think it'll ever be equaled. So that's Henry. Now I'm going to tell you about Bob's dash through the Bob the very next year. Bob went. That was 27. And then I'm going to bring them together because they meet. And two kindred spirits meet. So Bob Marshall, he wanted to put it, so he worked for 4 years in Missoula. I don't know if you knew that, as he had a master's in forestry from Harvard. And he served at the Intermountain Experiment Station there for 4 years. But this was his first time that we know of anyway, that he was actually in the Bob Marshall, which would bear his name. And so he wanted to go through this big wilderness and just kind of figure out what's wilderness, how do you administer a big wilderness? He'd been in the Selway, and you know, he was our wilderness pioneer. He loved wilderness, as you probably know. I'll tell you a little more about that. But so the first day, Bob arrived in the Flathead from Missoula, and he wrote everything down, everything. How far it was from each town that they were driving. And he didn't want to drive into the Spotted Bear. He wanted to hike into Spotted Bear over the top of the Swans. So one of the Forest Service guys took him there, and he walked over the top of the Swans, which is now Jewel Basin, and down the other side, and went to Elk Park Ranger Station. How many people know where Elk Park Ranger Station is? Or could you get to it now if I told you? No, it's under the reservoir. It's under Hungry Horse Reservoir. At that time, that was a major ranger station for the Forest Service. So when he got there, Lloyd Hornby, the supervisor of the Flathead Forest, was there to meet him. So this wasn't just some lark. A lot of people, when I first heard of this, before I read, this is Bob's journal, by the way. I'll take you page through it. When I first heard about this trip, I thought, or a lot of people think, oh, Bob just went through and just rushed up here and rushed up there, and it was completely planned. Every day was planned. The rangers knew he was coming. He was doing this to learn about this wilderness area and to convince everybody else that we need more. And so he hopped in Lloyd Hornby's truck after he got over the top of the Swans, and then they drove up to Spotted Bear. How many of you have been to Spotted Bear? There was a road. The road was there, and you can drive up to Spotted Bear. So when he got to Spotted Bear, he met a lot of Forest Service people, and he described them all like Charles Jackson Hash. Sally Hash is his granddaughter, and I always say, do you know that Bob Marshall said your grandfather looked like, and then he gave some name like, oh, my cross-country team at New York University, this guy looked just like him. He kept comparing people because he was just really into people, just really into them. And so he went to Spotted Bear, and Will and I started thinking, hey, he's mentioning this stuff in the journal about the characters that are in the book that we're writing, you know. So it was just really neat to see this because he mentioned a number of them. And so what he did was, just to set it up, the day before that, that he met Lloyd Hornby to take up to Spotted Bear, he had published a paper in the Service Bulletin called Wilderness as a Minority Right. And since this was a historical society, I put some sort of more obscure details in here about books, and I'll give you a little reading assignment, and we're going to do a trivia contest too. But at any rate, the day before he met Lloyd, this paper was published. So do you think he was talking about it? Of course he was. This was his idea of wilderness, and he was going to talk about it all the way through the Bob and try to convince everybody that wilderness is needed, even though it's only a minority of people that use it. And he based this wilderness as a minority right on a lot of Thomas Jefferson's philosophy, that even though only 2% of the people will ever use the wilderness, they still deserve the right to have it because it's so important to them, and it's a resource. To him, it was a very emotional thing. And when I first started reading Wilderness as a Minority Right, I thought, this sounds like he's replying to someone or something, you know, because this was hard to find, by the way. Our FECC librarian finally found this in an old service bulletin. So some of the things he said in the article, he argued for the rights of people to have wilderness available to use it, even if they might never use it. And some of his classic statements you may have heard of. We need the tonic of wilderness. His statement about solitude, complete independence, the beauty of undefiled panoramas, absolutely essential to happiness. He was talking about his own happiness and those like him. Passion for wilderness is just as genuine as the yearning for love and beauty. And life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is possible only in wilderness. See how he keeps pulling from Jefferson. And so I thought, it sounds like he's like justifying. And so I found out that he was actually responding to an article in the same journal from a few months before, and this was Manly Thompson. And Manly Thompson is basically saying, hey, look, you've got Gifford Pinchot saying the most use for the most people for the longest period of time. And wilderness is completely opposite of that. It's like it's very, very an elite group of people. You shouldn't even have it. And he was making fun about, if you read Call from the Wilds, Manly Thompson spends a fair amount of time making fun of Bob Marshall and his concept of wilderness. So Bob was ticked, and that's why he wrote Wilderness as a Minority Right. So this wasn't a lark on Bob's part. It was a well-planned trip. As I said, he had worked at the Rocky Mountain Forest Experiment Station in Missoula. When he got to Elk Park, they had his food all ready for him. He obviously didn't know the Bob, so someone had told him where he should go each time, and he said, where can I go for 40 miles this day, that day? And so he began this trek. We're just starting the trek now, here in a minute. So he could be emotionally inspired. That's what Bob was looking for. And he wants to see how this wilderness was administered, and he wants to convince everybody that we should have more of this. He thought, this is a great example. Let's get all these folks on board. And so what I called him is a wilderness evangelist, because he acts like an evangelist. He's possessed by it. And he was like this 1970s hippie dropped in the middle of this utilitarian South Park. You know, the packers, the trail crew folks, those folks were interested in using the forest, really, more than pure wilderness. So in my opinion, it was like dropping in a 1970s hippie into the 1928 utilitarian South Fork. And Dave Owen, through the word of mouth over the generations, said that a lot of the packers and folks in there said he was odd. They also said he was a little off. And they said he was a grandstander. He wore a huge pack and walked 40 miles and kept boasting about it. Really, he was just trying to get everybody. From what I understand about Bob, he talked really fast, and he was so enthusiastic, and he's bounced all over the place. You don't want to get an axe anywhere near him. You know, he wasn't that kind of forester. He was like an inspirationalist. And one of the reasons I call him this is because in his journal, he said, well, I gave this one talk to a group, and there was a guy there sitting in the audience, and he seemed dumb. I don't think he meant dumb like intelligent. I think he meant like he couldn't talk or something. He said, but afterwards, he came up, and he asked me about wilderness. And so, to me, that's like the preacher who has given his talk, and someone comes up to be saved. He convinced this guy that there's something special about wilderness. Well, a lot of the other people were probably skeptical. So that's why I call it that. So we're just starting now his 5-day dash. He trekked around Spotted Bear the next day after Hornby drove him up there. And then on to Black Bear, he climbed Spotted Bear Lookout, 40 miles to Black Bear Guard Station. That was day one. Guess who was the ranger at Black Bear that he stayed overnight with there? Anybody have a guess? It's Jim Deal, the college kid that slowed Henry Thol down. And so what do you think he's hearing from Jim Deal? Because he's there 2 nights. He's hearing how incredible this Henry Thol is. So he's hearing about it because Bob just walked 40 miles. He said, well, Henry, and I fully believe that Henry could have kept up with Bob, definitely in the winter, could have surpassed him in the winter. In the summer, I think he could have kept up with him because he was an amazing guy. So Jim was probably, you can just guess that they're talking about Henry and that trip. This is, by the way, these are Bob's journals here, Bancroft Library. So the next day, he got up at Black Bear, crossed the river at 8 a.m., which it's hard to believe, or 7 something. Yeah, crossed the ford at 8 a.m. and recrossed the ford at 8 a.m. So in only 12 hours, he hiked 42 miles from Black Bear Guard Station, up Helen Creek, over Pagoda, down the other side, across the White River, up Salt Mountain to the top of the Chinese Wall, and all the way back in 12 hours. And he had to have been running a lot of it to do that. In fact, one time we were talking, and one time his Selway Bitterroot Ranger said, he went on this 38-mile hike or something. I don't believe you did it. You couldn't have done it. You must have run. He said, oh, just only on the downhills, he said. So people have to realize, I've done a lot of trail running too, and you have to run to cover that kind of country in that amount of time. Because he also took 100 pictures on this trek. All the captions are there, but the pictures are lost. The captions are in his. How did he write all this stuff down? This was only 5 days, and he's morning till night he's hiking 40 miles a day. So anyway, then the next day on Friday, this is day 3. He visited Big Salmon Lake on his way in to Big Prairie. He's heading to Big Prairie, and they're expecting him. Who has seen Big Salmon Lake in here? Okay, all right, great. Yeah, you got to put it on your bucket list because it's an incredible place. And he dashed by Joe Murphy's cabin, which I don't know if he ever met Joe or not, but I'd like to think he did. And he reached Big Prairie, and he spent 2 nights there. And he met Henry Thol there. There's Henry. And then he met MOSE DELANARE, Will and I could never figure out how to spell his name. It was spelled about 5 different ways. And he was a Native American packer. Here we have the 1928 to 30 ranger station. So he spent a couple nights at Big Prairie. He was doing hikes out of there. And this is what Bob wrote about Henry Thol. He wrote more about Henry Thol than anybody else. So to me, when they met, they spent, like the evening talking together. I think probably when they went on an evening stroll, when Bob did, I bet Henry went with him. But he said about Henry, he said, he packed up and down the South Fork from Big Prairie in 1916 and 1917. The nearest road was 90 miles away at Coram. He's a fine photographer. So Bob said that too. It was kind of neat. So he spent a lot of time with Henry. I think they found a lot in common because, they're both kind of the uppermost and the toppermost in the backcountry. So on September 1, I redid this hike, much of it, last summer. He went on the hike to Tilson Lookout. These are pictures I took last summer. Tilson's burned now. It's not there. And then over to Prisoner Lake and the Flathead Alps and returned to Big Prairie. And then that evening, he took a evening walk to add some more miles to make sure he had at least 34 miles that day. He did that quite a bit. And this was his little evening walk, and this is, if you have seen the junction of the Youngs and Danaher, it's a gorgeous place. I got to study cutthroat up there for 12 years at that junction. But I'm thinking that Henry probably accompanied him on this walk. I'm guessing he might have, because he sure seemed to know a lot about Henry after his stay at Big Prairie. So on September 2nd then, Bob left Big Prairie, this is a 1924 picture of this bridge, and he hiked out to Holland Lake. And there he was, the people he met didn't know it, but he was heading for his PhD work at Johns Hopkins within a couple weeks, and then on to Alaska. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. This was his journal. So he hiked 35 miles that day, came out at Holland Lake. You probably know where that is. And then, believe it or not, I'm not going to cover it, but the next 3 days, he climbed mountains and went all over the Mission Mountain wilderness without a rest day. Just came out the valley and kept right on going. And then they transported him back to Missoula. So it was all planned. So to summarize then, Bob's dash through the South Fork, and we're winding up here. So I want to have lots of time for questions if anyone wants to stay. It was August 29th to September 2nd of 1928. It was 5 days, 182 miles, 37,000 feet in elevation. This guy wrote everything down, everything. I mean, you could spend days reading his journal because he just wrote. I don't know how he physically could have written all that down and still did all he did. It was obviously done while he was there. You could see the journals were, He met dozens of Forest Service folks and recorded impressions on actually quite a few of them. What he thought about them, what they looked like, what they were doing. Loved people. He preached wilderness values each evening. You can tell because he was giving talks. He was giving a talk in Condon after he got down and out, or Holland Lake, and trying to convince people there, hey, I just went through the Bob. You guys have got to have more wilderness, that kind of thing. He was just gushing with this enthusiasm. Everybody that knew him talked about it. But he was, encountering a lot of utilitarian people that didn't understand it. So think of how his enthusiasm carried him through. I mean, we have the Wilderness Act because of Bob Marshall. And again, I think he was a wilderness evangelist saving his flock. So to summarize it, he went from spotted bear to black bear to Chinese Wall, back to black bear, on to Big Prairie area, Tilson Lookout, Flathead Alps, back to Big Prairie and out to Holland Lake in 5 days. And wrote all these notes down and all that. So Thol and Marshall, I think there's little doubt that they were kindred spirits. It's so awesome that they got to meet. It would have been really neat to see the two of them do some big trek together because it would have been, these are the two masters, they're the uppermost or the toppermost in wilderness travel. This is actually a picture of Bob in Alaska here. And Bob's trip, I think really deeply influenced him because not long after this, well, I'm going to tell you, he goes to Alaska and explores there, but within a year, less than a year, in July of 29, remember, he did that when he was 27. Now he's only 28, and he named Gates of the Arctic in the Central Brooks Range while conducting his PhD work there. He named Gates of the Arctic, and he named it, he came up with a reason to do his research in Alaska because he looked at the map of the United States in Alaska and said, that's a blank spot. I want to go there, because he was a Lewis and Clark fan, an exploration fan. And so that's why he went to Alaska, and he was going, he got a person there to go with him, and they went up the North Fork of the KOYOKUK, where no European American had been yet, and named, or not, maybe one, ERNE, and named Gates of the Arctic. And this is Bob standing on North Dunarak in Alaska, and I'll tell you where you can read about this. Again, less than a year after he went through the Bob, and here's what he said. He said, "We reached the summit." This was on Tumbled Mountain. "The view from the top gave us an excellent idea of the jagged country toward which we are heading. Close at hand was a precipitous pair of mountains, one on each side of the North Fork. I bestowed the name of Gates of the Arctic on them, christening the east portal Boreal Mountain and the west portal Frigid Cracks. 28-year-old kid doing this. And look at the kind of, he was an incredible writer. You got to read some of his stuff, and I'll tell you about it. But what vision, what unbelievable vision this guy had. So in the book Alaska Wilderness, which I'll show you here, he named more than 100 features in the Brooks Range, and he's really a great explorer. He doesn't get a lot of credit for that. This is this is Jesse Allen, who went with him on one of the trips up there. So right after that, he wrote The Problem of the Wilderness in Scientific American. This is his classic explanation of wilderness and why it should be protected. If you want to read one thing by Bob about, understand what he thought about wilderness, read The Problem of the Wilderness. And you can Google it. It's at Scientific American. And in that, he talked about some of the concepts of wilderness as a minority right, but he also said the physical and spiritual values of wilderness are emotionally, are key to the emotional need of many people. By the way, does anybody know where that is? That's in the Bob. That's the vortex of the Bob, and it has to do with it's kind of whitish colored. White River, yeah, okay, you win that. We're almost wrapped up, and we got to do a trivia contest here real quick. But so Bob's definition, he worked into his definition of wilderness, which he talked about preserving a primitive environment, no possible conveyance by any mechanical means, and they basically, the Wilderness Act picked most of this up. And that was from that paper, The Problem with the Wilderness. And in the article, he also suggested the formation of the Wilderness Society. And he was one of the 5 original founders. And the person not pictured here was Aldo Leopold. And so they're the 5 founders of the Wilderness Society. And so, my Bob Marshall reading list. First, Arctic Village. He wrote Arctic Village in 1933. It's been reissued. It's an incredibly fun book. He did an archaeological or an anthropological study on the natives and the Euro-Americans living in Wiseman, Alaska. Because he was up there and he encountered these people and said, these are the funnest, happiest people I've ever met. I got to figure it out. And so he actually did an anthropological study. He tested the children. He got all kinds of advice before he went. And so that's Arctic Village. And then his hallmark book, if you want to read a book that really shows you Bob's heart, is Alaska Wilderness. And Alaska Wilderness is his description of all of his adventures in the Brooks Range. And you can get that at Amazon. I actually got it through a used book search. And then A Wilderness Original, Life of Bob Marshall, goes through a lot of the facts about Bob. You'll learn a lot in that book. And any of his articles on wilderness or correspondence in the Journal of Fisheries. And did Bob inspire me? Yeah. I wrote a children's article about him in Wild Outdoor World in 2001, Wilderness Hero. Named my kid after him, Kevin Marshall Fraley. Here he is up in Bob's country in the North Fork of the KOYOKUK, and repeating a 120-mile trip that Bob did all the way back down to Wiseman in Arctic Alaska. This is coming down ERNE Creek. He packed in there with his raft, his little raft, and went 120 miles. And thanks a lot. So if we could pass these out.
You need to repeat what people say just for questions so that for the teams.
Okay,
I just want
repeat the questions, okay. Yeah, this is our trivia contest, which we'll get to here. Get it done real quick here. By the way, I made it up to Wiseman, Alaska this summer. My son guided me around up there. And we walked some of the initial parts of Bob's treks. All right, so I've got two of my previous books that I'm going to give away as prizes here. And so I just have 2 copies of Wild River Pioneers. If you've heard of the bootleg lady at Glacier Park, she's in here, but of course from the Flathead, you may not have heard of it.
Is your new book on sale here?
Yeah, and I'll be staying around signing books because that's just one story. That's just one chapter in the book, and it's a lot of book for the price that Far Country put together. It really is $14.95 for this big thick book. I go, whoa, they did a great job on it. So, all right, so if you don't have anything to write with, you can kind of guess, I guess. So what we'll do is, if you can put your name on here, we're gonna you go ahead and make it out right now, if you would. And then I'm going to go and we'll correct our own papers, and then we'll put our papers in a box and draw for the book. So go ahead and, do we have any pencils? I should have asked you about that before.